My name is Jamie McPherson, and I'm one of the ground operations coordinators for the Commemorative Air Force Air Base, Arizona. We're here in Walla Walla, Washington today, and we're going to go look at a B-17 Flying Fortress and a B-25 Mitchell bomber today and get a tour inside. This here has now been converted to a donation box, but this was once a 100-pound bomb, as you would see found inside of these bombers. It's not that big objectively, it's about 4 feet tall, but it does weigh quite a bit. And when we usually talk about bombs, actually the poundage we're referring to is actually the explosive force measured as TNT, not the actual weight of the bomb. So for instance, a 100-pound bomb would actually probably weigh closer to 200 pounds with the casing of metal. So behind me here, we have a B-25 Mitchell bomber. This one here is known as Maid in the Shade. This is one of the only combat veteran B-25s left in the world that flies. There's about 40 aircraft that are airworthy right now that are B-25s, of which only 2 saw combat to my knowledge, and this is the only one that saw combat in Europe. This one specifically was actually used mostly to bomb strategic targets like railroad bridges, aqueducts, that kind of stuff in Yugoslavia and the Mediterranean. It has 15 combat missions under its belt. This one specifically is a J model, which is known as a gunship. It's kind of a predecessor to today's A-10 Warthog. There's 12 50 caliber machine guns in total that were basically designed to gun down enemy targets, then release some bombs and go home. So as you can see here, the name of this airplane is Maid in the Shade, and there's a really fun story behind the name of this specific B-25. When we were first formed as a unit, we were donated a B-17 that we restored. We built it out in the open Arizona sun, and once we were done building it, we actually built a hangar to store it in, and we were then donated this aircraft as a restoration project. And so this was the first aircraft that what was then the Arizona wing before it became Air Base Arizona restored inside of the hangar, and thus it was quite literally made in the shade. All right, so this right here is known as a WASP engine behind me. It's a 14-cylinder radial engine. So if you look close, you'll probably only count 7. That's because it's a twin bank. So you have 7 on one side and 7 cylinders behind it. Now, the interesting thing about radial engines like this one is that, of course, since it's a full circle, 360 degrees of power, the oil pulls down by gravity in the lower cylinders right here. So if you look down here, we've actually installed little catch cans to catch some of that oil. We always like to joke radial engines don't leak, they just mark their territory. In this case, this engine actually creates about 1,700 horsepower. There's 2 of them, 1 on each side, for a total of 3,400 horsepower. This is a fairly powerful engine configuration for its time. And so because of that, this is one of the few bombers that can take off in a very short distance that we operated during World War II. This one specifically can actually take off in about 600 feet when properly configured. And that's part of why you'll see these used, for instance, in the very famous Doolittle raid, where they took off from aircraft carriers to bomb Japan. Here are 2 of the cheat guns. Like I said, there's 12 50 caliber machine guns on board this aircraft. So these ones specifically would be operated by the pilot. You have another one here in the nose that is operated by the pilot, and then this one would be operated by the bombardier, who would sit in the nose. Then you've got 2 more here on the side, and then on each waist you have 1. You have 2 up top in the turret, and then you have 2 in the tail for the tail gunner. These machine guns can fire at about 10 rounds per second, so 600 rounds a minute each. So if you think about it, that's 120 bullets a second, so that's a lot of firepower coming out of this aircraft. So if you look right here, this is the bomb sight for the bombardier. This is essentially the aiming device used to drop the bombs. And if you look here at the nose, this part here is very flat. The reason we keep this part so flat is actually so there's no distortion for the bomb sight. That is a Norden bomb sight. So that's a fun, interesting story. The Norden bomb sight was the 3rd most expensive item developed and produced by the US during World War II. The most expensive things being number 1, the B-29 bomber built by Boeing, and number 2, the Manhattan Project, also known as the atomic bomb. So this was the 3rd most expensive thing we developed during the war, and it was kept very secret. And generally bomber crews were required to remove these after mission and put a cloak over them and deliver them to an armed guard who would actually guard those 24/7 when they weren't in use. So if you look inside of here, in our bomb bay, we actually collect signatures from different World War II veterans who served on board different B-25s. Notably here, we have a veteran of the Doolittle Tokyo raid from 1942. Another one here, Ed Saylor, he's a Tokyo Raider as well. And here's a 3rd one. So there's a number of them. Then over here you have a gentleman, Ken Calkins, he was actually one of the maintenance crew on a B-25 out of California during the war. And last but certainly not least, another highlight I like to show is Betty Hayes here. She actually worked in the Kansas City plant of North American Aviation building these aircraft. So she is one of the Rosie the Riveters. About 80% of this aircraft was manufactured and assembled by women. So if you look above you here, there's actually some bombs. I believe here you have a 500 pounder and these are 250 pounders. Like we were talking about earlier, the poundage is really referring to the explosive power of the bomb, not the actual gross weight of the bomb. And here are the shackles that essentially the bombs would hook into. So typically when they drop, they're released in a staggered formation. So you'd have one drop, then one from the other side and so on, but in a very quick succession. What I always like to point out to people too is these bombs are pretty much gravity operated only. They're not like modern day cruise missiles or anything that can steer to a target. So the best way I like to kind of explain this is imagine you're driving at 30 miles an hour down the road with a can of Coke and you want to throw it in a trash can, right? You're really trying to math out how to get it into that hole perfectly. So bombing back then was a lot more of a mathematical science, and it was a lot less accurate than it is today. And that's why the Norden bomb sight was such a critical piece. It could do about 60 different computations, not just solutions, but 60 computations, including different things like airspeed, wind direction, to help calculate where the bomb would fall. So it was a very important piece of the equipment that kind of goes hand in hand with this. The other thing you'll notice in this bomb bay specifically that you'll see differently in most other bombers of the time, especially like our B-17, is there's no direct pass-through in here because the bomb bay absorbs most of the fuselage center. There is actually a small crawl space right above us that I'll show you guys later, but essentially there's no way to walk through the bomb bay. So if you look right down here below you, you've seen this ladder. Now the ladder we have there is for ease of spectators to come in and out. There is a ladder there that is designed. It's just a 90-degree vertical. It's a little harder to get up. And that's the only way in and out of here by design. There are some emergency exits, like this one here behind me. Right here, it's essentially a sunroof that you can go through. And then in the nose, the bombardier had his own emergency exit as well. The seats behind you that the cameraman is sitting in, those are retrofitted. Originally, there would be a jump seat and a platform there for the turret gunner who would operate this turret gun above you. And then here would have been a variety of different gauges, switches, and fuse panels. These here have been slightly modified and modernized, of course. But the flight engineer was basically the third member of the crew that would help operate the aircraft along with the pilot and co-pilot. Of course, we've modernized things a bit. So here's one of the jump seats that would have been there originally, along with the platform that would have been where the cameraman is now sitting. So originally it's an electric turret, so he would actually poke through here and there would be electric controls for him to turn it. It turns and swivels 360 degrees. It can aim pretty much horizontal and up and around, so it mostly protects from oncoming attackers from above. The flight engineer had a lot of different roles, but nowadays, of course, you have a lot more automation in an aircraft. So a lot of things like fuel management, emergency management, fire risk, anything like that fell onto the engineer, right? If a control cable, because most of them are actually exposed in here, if those were damaged in flight, he would essentially repair those so we can control the aircraft. So that was a lot of his key things, was basically in-flight repairs and ensuring that the systems are operating properly. Because nowadays, of course, we've got that all automated, but back then a lot of that was still done by hand, which is why you essentially have 3 essential crew to operate this aircraft as opposed to 2, as you would nowadays in, say, an airline or something like that. Okay, so in here, we're in the cockpit of the B-25. And as you can probably tell, if you know anything about aviation, we have modernized this a little bit, right? You've got your comms and your transponder and all the good stuff that's required nowadays of an aircraft. But a lot of it really is the same basic principles that you'd start out with if you learn even nowadays in a basic Cessna airplane or something, right? You've got your 6-pack here. You've got your control quadrant here with throttle, props, and mixture. Trim wheel here, of course, right? Landing gear down below. And what's nice too is you've got these windows here. They open quite wide. It's just a fun little lever right here. You just slide it forwards and backwards. But yeah, other than that, like I say, you've got, of course, your yoke here. And then you've got your rudder pedals and brakes down below. And that's pretty much it. It's very much based on a lot of the same principles that you still learn today. So if you look right there, that's essentially a crawl space above the bomb bay that goes to the back. So that was the only way in flight for the crew to maneuver back and forth between the front and the rear of the aircraft, would have been that very tight crawl space. Now granted, most of these Individuals who flew on board this aircraft at the time were somewhere between ages 18 and 22, and back then people were a little smaller and a lot skinnier than they are today, right? Our diet was very different. But so all these young men were crawling back and forth through there. That was their only way. So that's our crawl space again, just from the other side. So we're now in the rear of the aircraft behind the bomb bay. And these seats down here, they've been added for the safety and enjoyment of our passengers. But these two 50 caliber machine guns here are every bit as real and original as the aircraft itself. So if you look up here on each side, there's storage boxes. Those would hold ammunition for the 50 caliber machine gun. And then the machine gunners would stand back here, grab it, and then they have a trigger here that's been manufactured to basically alleviate the trigger in the back so they can use trigger fingers like they were trained to do. And then of course you can almost stand up here. This is probably the most comfortable part of the aircraft. Look in the back, of course, you have the tail gunner position. So it's a little tunnel you crawl through, and then basically a bicycle seat you sit on top with two 50 caliber machine guns in front of you. And that completes our presentation on the B-25. So behind me here, we have a B-17 Flying Fortress. This one is known as Sentimental Journey, and it's been in our possession since 1972. So to tell you a little bit about the B-17, originally it was developed actually as a submarine hunter for lower altitudes, but was quickly found to be a very capable platform for high altitude bombing with a few modifications. So this here is a G model, which is the last model made. About half of the roughly 12,800 B-17s that were made are actually the G model. So the G model is very distinctive because it has this little chin turret below it with two 50 caliber machine guns that are remote controlled. Now this one here is Sentimental Journey. And her journey actually began in the fall of 1944 when she rolled off the assembly line at Douglas in Long Beach, California. Douglas was one of three companies, along with Boeing and Lockheed, that made the B-17 during the war. Boeing actually designed it and produced the most, but since there was such a demand for them and Boeing couldn't fill the whole demand, they were also built by Lockheed and Douglas. So this one was built in Long Beach, California, and was sent to the Pacific. Now this one didn't actually serve in any bombing missions, but it did serve in wartime in the Pacific as a photo reconnaissance aircraft. So part of what it did is the entire bomb bay was actually gutted and had specialized photo mapping equipment put in there. That's what it did during the war and right after the war. Later on, it's my understanding it was used actually as what we call a mothership for early drones. So they had surplus B-17 bombers that were remote controlled, and the mothership would basically have the drone operators in it. And then after that, it was relegated to firefighting duty. So the bomb bay was again repurposed to hold fire retardant or water, and was then used to go on water bombing missions. And following that, it was donated to us in 1972, and it was the first restoration project that what then was the Arizona wing had, which is now Air Base Arizona. And that kind of brings us up to today. So if you look right here at the nose, you've of course got the bombs up top. Those are essentially, in World War II, those would have been bombing missions that the aircraft has flown. Early in the war, 25 missions was the requirement for a crew to go home. And later that was bumped up to 35 and even later to 50 because as we had more air superiority, the missions, though they were still very grueling and hard, were perceived to be a little quote-unquote easier, and there was a bit of manpower concern towards the end of the war, so the mission tally went up. Now in this case, those bombs, however, do not signify the amount of missions it flew, but rather the amount of tour stops it made on its first tour rotation after being restored. And if you look below it, you'll see something you didn't see during the war, which is actually 3 movie cameras. Now in this case, there's 3 movies this airplane has starred in. 1941, All the Brave Young Men, and most recently Masters of the Air. And there are currently about 40 B-17s left in the world, of which about 10 hold an airworthiness certificate. And as of this year, right now, only 3 are airworthy and actively flying. 2 here in the US and 1 in the United Kingdom. There's a lot of them that are currently undergoing either heavy maintenance or restoration. And this is the only one this year that you can actually see on tour and buy rides on. So it's pretty much a one-of-a-kind experience right now. So right behind me here, we have one of the 4 engines on this aircraft. So this is a 4-engine bomber. In this case, we have a Wright 1820 behind me, which is a 9-cylinder radial engine. So again, the gravity of course pulls the oil down to the lower cylinders, which causes the leaks like you can see here. We always like to joke it's not leaking, it's just marking its territory. In this case, it has 9 cylinders, creates 1,200 horsepower per engine, and these engines are actually what we call turbo supercharged. Now, the reason for that is not so much necessarily to get more power out of them, but rather to create more pressure in the engine. So at a high altitude, you're basically simulating a lower altitude. That way, essentially, the engine performs better at higher altitude. So this is a big tire, of course. 2 of them, one on each side. This is tail dragger, as we like to call it. So the rear landing gear is right there. It's a little bit smaller. All 3 of them do retract into the aircraft in flight. So in here, we are inside the bomb bay, of course, of the B-17. And again, we have a variety of signatures we've collected over the year from different crew members and people who helped build them. One that's most notable here is a gentleman called Lucky Luckadoo. He actually just passed away 2 days ago. And he's very well known. He wrote a book called Damn Lucky. Excellent book. I strongly recommend it. It should be an enjoyable read for anyone interested. Here we have another gentleman, for instance. He completed his 35 missions as a ball turret gunner. And we'll show you the ball turret here in a minute. It's always something people find very fascinating. And then, of course, above you, you've got bombs. These are a little bigger. These are 500-pounders. The B-17 was capable of hauling quite a few of those, of course, by comparison. A little bigger payload. And then one of the more noteworthy things here, of course, is you can walk between the front and the back. This right here is what we refer to as the catwalk. It's about a 6-inch wide walkway from the cockpit to the radio room. So here we have the ball turret. Now if you look, I'm about 6 feet tall. I'm crouched down. I can barely fit in this, right? This is a very tight, confined space. Typically it was reserved for shorter crew members, but that didn't mean that tall people were immune to being drafted into this position. Contrary to popular belief, this is actually one of the safest positions in the aircraft because the Germans would typically attack from above. So being below the aircraft gave you a little bit of protection and some cover. Now the way it works is this actually reclines down into the fuselage, and they would climb in from inside the airplane into the ball turret and then would turn it on, and it's electric, so it was operated that way. And they could swivel it 360 degrees, aim down and around, and protect the aircraft as best possible. Once you're locked in here, it's a very isolated position. The size of this tail, proportionate to the aircraft, is very big. Part of that design is essentially redundancy, so this tail can take a lot of damage and retain a good amount of rudder authority in flight. Which further kind of complements the nickname Flying Fortress. This airplane can take one hell of a beating and still stay airborne. You know, it's definitely well made, but the fuselage itself, it's made of very thin aluminum, about as thick as 2 Coca-Cola cans pushed together. So essentially if it gets hit, right, the bullet goes in one end through the aircraft and out the other. There's absolutely nothing there. This is actually Manny Quinn. He's our tail gunner here in the B-17, so he's got 2 50 caliber machine guns out the back, of course, to protect us from anyone sneaking up from behind. Definitely a tighter position, definitely the most isolated because he's further back and more physically removed from anyone than any other position in the aircraft. So just be careful, it is tight. What we'll do is we'll start in the nose and kind of work our way backwards. All right, so behind me we have what I like to call the best seat in aviation. It's an absolutely incredible view, but this is the bombardier's seat. So he's one of the 4 officers on board of the 10-man crew on this B-17. His job essentially is to calculate where to drop the bombs. They were talking about earlier with the Norden bomb sight. There's one of those right behind me. And then over here we have the navigator's table. So the navigator was in charge of strictly navigating this aircraft to the target. And then if you look over here, we've got, of course, 2 50 caliber machine guns, one for each of the crew members in here to use. This is another signature piece of the G model to have 2 50 caliber machine guns in there. Originally there were none, later there was one, and on the G model there is 2. The other thing you can see here is this is one of the microphone inputs for the aircraft. So actually everyone in here, like I said, it was an unpressurized system in this aircraft, so you're exposed to the elements. So everyone had a throat activated mic they could talk to each other that way because it's very loud, of course, in an airplane like this. And then down here, this is what's known as a rheostat. So when I was talking earlier about the bunny suit they would wear under all the leather clothes, they could plug into here and essentially turn up almost like a dimmer switch on your light. They could set how much heat they wanted. Now most veterans I've talked to will tell you there's really only two settings, too hot or too cold. But in theory, this was variably adjustable to keep them relatively comfortable as best possible. And then if you look up here behind, or above me, behind you in a minute, I'll show you what's known as the celestial dome. So this is primarily, actually no joke, for stargazing, so that you can actually look around and see where the stars are to help navigate, right? So it's known as the celestial dome for that reason. All right, so if you look up here, coming up the small ladder into the cockpit, this is the pilot seat and this is the co-pilot seat. Configuration here is a little roomier, but still pretty tight compared to a B-25. Now the visibility is pretty nice too, but a little smaller, and there you can see your celestial dome that we were just looking at. Up here we've put all the modern avionics separate to all the original stuff. Of course the instruments have been redone, but it's not too different from its original configuration. One of the big differences you'll see here is instead of having the conventional lever setup of throttle, prop, and mixture, you have your mixtures here, all four of them. You actually have all four throttles here. So this bottom one is a throttle and this top one is a throttle. So this is essentially the two on the left, throttles 1 and 2, and then throttles 3 and 4 right here. So if you watch a war movie, you'll often see they'll take the underhand and move them like this. That is actually so they can control all four, but you can also control the tops or the bottoms separately as needed. And then here you have all four of the propeller pitches right there to adjust. You've got actually one of your trim wheels right here for the rudder trim, and then your elevator trim right there. And then here, of course, you've got a control yoke, much like most other bombers of the era. And that one, of course, says Boeing, right? The Pride of Washington right there. And then if you look up here, of course, you've got a great visibility. You essentially have a sunroof to help spot other people in the formation, right? These would fly in a relatively tight formation, so being able to have good situational awareness of what was above you was pretty important. And of course, secondary benefit, it helps light up the cockpit, and tertiary benefit, you can spot enemy fighters that way if they're coming your way. Since, like I was saying earlier, especially in Europe, the Germans would typically attack from above and dive at you. And then we'll look behind us here in a moment at the engineer station. So this is where the flight engineer would hang out. So he has a jump seat here to sit on, but typically he would be standing in here. If you look behind you, there's a fuse panel and some other things that are essential for operation of this aircraft. Like we talked about in the B-25, you absolutely needed a third person in the cockpit to manage the systems, but he would also be the turret gunner, not unlike in the B-25. All right, so if you look out behind me here at the engines, right, there's two on either side, and if you look at the inboard side, you'll see those are painted while the rest of the aircraft is still pretty much bare metal for the most part. And the reason for that is actually to prevent glare from blinding the pilots or inhibiting their vision while operating the aircraft. All right, now if you look here, I'm in a pretty tight spot, quite literally and also figuratively. So this is what we know as the catwalk. It's about 6 inches wide, and it takes us from the front of the aircraft to the rear, where we have the radio room, the waist gunners, the ball turret, and the tail gunner. And this is the bomb bay. So on either side would have bombs, typically a full assortment of them. And it was actually the bombardier's job in flight to come in here and arm the bombs. So he would have to remove safety pins, and he was required to keep those on his person as proof the bombs had been armed and primed for being dropped. Yep, so these are primarily seats we've added for passengers. So here you've got 3 extra seats for passengers. This would have been the only original seat in here, and it wouldn't have had a seat back, and this is where the radio operator would have sat. And this is where all the radio equipment would have been. And then on this side primarily would have been a life raft and some area for the crew to basically sit down, that kind of sit down together like in a bobsled almost in each other's laps, for the waist gunners and the tail gunner during takeoff and landing, so it's somewhere secure to sit. And then this 50 caliber machine gun here can actually be moved down these rails and used to be fired upwards to protect the aircraft from oncoming attackers from above. Moving on, right there below us is the ball turret. So this is how you would have originally accessed it, from inside the aircraft through that hatch there. and that's how you get in and out of it. Now, another fun thing I like to show people in here, so if you look right here, behind this box, there's a little funnel. That funnel is known as a relief tube. I'll let you guess what that means, but it is exactly what you're thinking. And standing up right here, of course, we have two .50 caliber machine guns again. And here we have more control cables for the aircraft. And so you'd have two waist gunners in here. Now, if you notice, the two guns are actually staggered. On earlier versions of the B-17, they were side by side, and there was no plexiglass. There was just originally a window. Problem is the window would freeze up and you couldn't see out of it, so they've removed the windows and this would just be open. So there'd be a slipstream of wind coming through here. So think about, you're going over 200 miles an hour at below 70 and you're standing by this window. Absolutely crazy environmental effect, right? But again, you've got these two .50 cals here and they're staggered in parts, so as these two crew members swing around shooting guns, they're not bumping into each other, they're traversing past each other. The other thing I always love to show people about these .50 calibers in the B-17, if you look right here, this is actually a holographic sight, not unlike a red dot sight used by the military or law enforcement nowadays. A lot of people don't realize those already existed during World War II. And again, here is a specialized trigger, so they can grab it and just use their trigger finger. And then here you've got, of course, a big box full of .50 caliber machine gun rounds. It would not be uncommon for them to bring extra on board if possible, but typically by the time you'd get back from a conventional mission, there would be nothing left. In Hollywood, of course, you see these guys just laying down on it. In reality, typically about a 1 to 2 second burst each time they'd spot an aircraft. So 10 to 20 rounds max, partially reserve ammo and partially because of how fast things were actually happening here in the air. This is the only place in the aircraft where a large person can stand up, is right here. For reference, I'm about 6'1" and I can stand freely here, but this is the only place in the entire aircraft where that's possible. Anywhere else, you're generally going to have to duck down, and of course towards the tail, things taper down again. So as we move through, we start getting smaller again. Yep. And then our tail gunner would crawl through here past the tail gear, past the landing gear, and towards the back. And they're actually the only crew member with a dedicated escape hatch to the left there. I don't know if you can see it from there. That was the only way for them to escape. And we don't let people back there because of the tail gear, of course. So we're with Air Base Arizona, which is part of the Commemorative Air Force. The Commemorative Air Force is comprised of over 60 wings across North America and Europe and Mexico. There's one wing in Europe and one in Mexico. But we operate over 160 flying World War II aircraft, so the world's biggest World War II aircraft operator. Each different wing has different things. Some are more like a flying club, others like ours are a little bigger. We have our own museum down in Mesa, Arizona with over 30 aircraft on static display as well as 7 that you can fly on. And those are generally year-round possibilities, but during the summer, to beat the heat and kind of get out and let the whole country enjoy these aircraft, we take some of the bigger aircraft like our B-17 and our B-25 on tour across the US. Nowadays, we tend to kind of alternate between an East Coast tour and a West Coast tour every other year. And we make different stops, typically from May through September. So for about 4 months, we're somewhere else every week. So you'll see about 16 to 20 stops a year typically for us. And we're an all-volunteer organization. So most of us, like myself, will come out for about 2 weeks at a time and basically make this possible and help any way we can, right? Whether that's selling rides, whether we're flight crew. The pilots, of course, dedicate their time as well. Most of those are either airline pilots or career military pilots who fly these aircraft for us. And so everything we do is self-funded, right? We, of course, once in a while get a generous benefactor, but for the most part, the way we operate is all of our revenue from rides, from tours, from souvenirs that we sell in our portable gift shop trailers, and of course the revenue that the museum creates is how we fund all of this. And again, we're a nonprofit, so all of this just goes right back into the organization and into trying to maintain these aircraft and keep them airworthy as long as possible for others to enjoy. The way I always like to put it is we're basically holding the door to the past open as long as possible for people to go through it. And so being able to come out on tour and help make that a possibility is an honor and a privilege for all of us. There's nothing more redeeming that I've ever done in my time.